Good day, and hope you're okay this day. And today we have with us Chris Bray.
Hi, Betty.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. How about you?
Fine. And you're in the legislature.
Yes.
You want to tell us a little bit about what committee you're on and what you're doing and what the whole legislature is doing?
Sure. So today is April 16th, and this is like a spring ritual for us, the two of us getting together.
Yeah.
Although outside the weather's not very friendly today with a nice storm. So this is my 10th year in the legislature. I did 4 years in the House before, serving with you. And then I moved over to the Senate side, and now I'm finishing up my 6th year in the Senate. In the Senate, we serve on two committees, a morning committee and an afternoon committee. In the mornings, I chair Natural Resources and Energy, and in the afternoon, I serve on Education. So,
and what does the Education Committee do?
So we look more in the world of education. It's really split in that there's the financing of education, which the Finance Committee takes the lead on. And then in terms of school programs, policies, and things like that, how we actually run the schools, what we're trying to get done, that's what the Senate Education Committee focuses on.
And are they coming up with a plan?
So the House, as you know, always the revenue bills, the tax bills start in the House. And there was a major rewrite of how we might raise money for education. It's actually two tax bills blended into one. So I'll separate them out. The first thing that happened was because of changes in the federal tax code, Vermont is receiving about an extra $30 million over anticipated revenue. And again, that's not anything Vermont changed, but the federal code changed, and that influences what comes to Vermont. So the state is looking at how we might refund that $30 million back to people, and that's one group of proposed tax changes. The second group of proposed changes deals with how we fund education itself, and that's looking at moving away from being primarily led by property taxes to starting to rely more heavily on income tax. And that's actually turned out to be a fairly controversial tax proposal. And as I was mentioning before we got started, that's actually gone to the Finance Committee, which is beginning to take testimony on it and sort it out and see whether or not they agree with the House plan or not. And that'll be happening. So again, today's the 16th. We have probably about 4 weeks of the legislature left. So we're really getting into, this is like...
big stuff.
Yeah, it's like if this were a baseball game, I think we're coming into the 8th inning now. So things will pick up, and we'll be very busy the next month wrapping up a lot of bills. I know, for instance, in the Natural Resources Committee, we have 18 bills up on the wall, as they say, and we've taken testimony on all of them. And in the next 2 weeks, we'll be sorting out, making final edits, knitting things together, and passing bills out. So,
what the legislature does is when it gets a bill, it starts testimony on it.
Right.
And then sends it to the Senate when it's done.
Sure.
You don't wait till a certain date and send all 18 bills.
No.
You send them as you get them.
Yeah, although this year we received so the legislative session is, as you know, divided into before town meeting week and after town meeting week. And we set informally as an agreement between House and Senate, we call that the crossover date.
Yes.
It's an agreed upon date by which all bills need to be sent to the other side in order to guarantee that they'll be taken up. And a lot of bills come jamming through the door from one side to the other right around that final crossover date. So we got a whole slew of bills through, and we've taken testimony on all of them. Now we have to prioritize and finish up the bills. I think we will get most of them done.
And how do you study a bill?
When a bill comes in, the first thing we do is we invite the originating, the sponsor of the bill to come over, tell us what either problem or opportunity they saw and why they proposed the bill to begin with. So they do a, what is this bill about? Why did I propose it? And explain it from that point of view. Then the next step is we have legislative counsel, the legal staff of the legislature, come in and we read through the bill from start to finish.
Which is different at that point than what the bill was originally.
Right, exactly. So, well, you...
And how did that happen?
You mean in terms of how many changes? Yeah, so very few bills go right from committee to floor, at least in my experience. They almost always have some sort of impact on revenues of the state one way or another. So a lot of our bills travel from out of committee, and they may go to the finance committee if it affects revenues of the state, and they may go, then they'd go to appropriations if they affect expenditures. But on natural resources, some of our bills affect, like our clean water work also affects agricultural practices. So agriculture may take a look at the bill. And in terms of the law enforcement provisions around clean water, judiciary may take the bill and look at what the rules and regulations are and the enforcement provisions. So, and then this year we're working also on a bill that affects transportation. So the transportation committee is looking at the bill. So the biggest example I know of collaboration is when we did the Clean Water Act, Vermont Clean Water Act a few years back. 7 Senate committees all looked at that bill. We were the home committee for the bill, but 7 committees all chipped in and offered their expertise and perspective. And so it was a lot of work getting all that put into one coherent bill at the end, which I think we did.
Yeah, and then when that's a change from what bill was originally introduced as.
Sure.
It's the same idea, but and then that goes to the House, and they do the same thing.
Right, they start all over.
Yeah.
So.
And then, so you've got the Senate bill and the House bill, and you get a committee of conference.
Sure, and if time allows, the other thing that can happen is if it were a Senate bill and it went to the House and the House changed it and they send it back to us with changes, we can propose further changes and return it to the House, or we can ask for a committee of conference and just sit down and basically resolve the differences between the two versions. So depending on the timing, sometimes the bill goes back and forth a few times before a committee of conference is called, but the only way to wrap up almost for sure is to call a committee of conference.
Yeah, half House and half Senate.
Right. Although once in a while, I've only heard of it once, a committee of conference gets locked, comes to a deadlock, and they actually dissolve that committee and reform another committee and try a committee of conference, half House, half Senate, 3 from each, and try all over again. So I've never seen it not get sorted out in the end.
Yeah.
But sometimes it can be pretty exhausting to get there.
Yeah. And you have a deadline.
Yeah, we go home.
Yeah.
We adjourn and go home. And sometimes people say, well, how long is your session? And so we budget for 18 weeks every year. Mm-hmm. And we usually try to adjourn within 17. So we leave some money and time in the bank. And that's in case we get called back for a veto session, so that we won't have extraordinary expenses. We'll already have money set aside for that. So I think right now we're probably aiming to adjourn around the 10th of May, leave some money in the bank, and see if we have to come back for a veto session, which this year I think seems on the likely side. The governor sent over a memo on March 20th, and he identified 13 bills that he didn't say veto, but he said he would not be able to support them, which is, I think, a polite way of saying, I will have to veto these if they get to my desk in their current form. So then the question is, can we learn from the governor what he means by that, and then maybe sort out the points of difference and get to something that's agreeable to both the legislature and the administration.
And still works.
And still works, right.
I was going to ask another question, and now I forgot it.
Right. Well, and speaking of, a bill, and does it still work? So we passed one of the biggest bills we worked on this year was S260, a clean water funding and planning bill. And we sent that over to and before that, happily from my point of view as the sponsor, it passed the Senate unanimously on a roll call vote of 29-0, and off to the House it went. The House has actually made very substantial changes to it. I wouldn't quite say they threw it all out and started over, but big changes. So now we'll have to sort things out with the House. And then meanwhile, the governor had weighed in on the Senate version and said that he thought he'd have to veto that bill. So we're trying to learn from the governor or his staff the real reasons for that. I say real reasons. It was a very terse statement. So we don't know what the governor meant by this brief statement, and we're looking to get a lawyer's statement so that the lawyers can read it very carefully and help us understand exactly what's agreeable and not so agreeable to the governor's staff.
Well, what did the Clean Water Act do?
So in 2015, we passed the Vermont Clean Water Act. I think most people are familiar with the Federal Clean Water Act from the 1970s, but the federal law doesn't address all kinds of situations. For instance, runoff from farms, for instance. That's something we regulate under Vermont law. Or wetlands is another thing we regulate under Vermont law. So in order to do better on those, and also runoff from roads and you name it, we decided to improve all our practices in Vermont, and so we passed Act 64 in 2015, and we called it the Vermont Clean Water Act. And that basically, if rain falls in a location, we looked at how could we improve the way we handle water. So in other words, the rain falls everywhere. So whether we're talking farmland or forest land, municipal land, residential land, commercial land, you name it, we're looking at wherever water is coming down, let's try to manage it well so that we don't have pollution and we don't have excessive runoff from a place. So that's
quite a job.
It is, and the mantra for the development of that bill was everybody in, and it's comprehensive in its scope, and it's and I think people have been sticking to it. We've done a lot of work improving the laws, regulations, plans, programs to really look at how to make progress on cleaning up Vermont's waters, because we have many waterways that are impaired in terms of water quality. And here in Middlebury, I think everyone's very aware of Lake Champlain, for instance, where unfortunately, if I talk to people who have been here 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, they report that over their lifetime they've seen a steady decline in water quality in the lake. And people will say, well, I used to swim in it all the time, now I won't swim in the lake anymore, and things like that. So, but there's a scientific basis for it as well. I mean, but the point is, in the end, we're all very reliant on clean water. Water's held into public trust. No one owns it. So it's something that we share amongst ourselves. And I think we have a mutual obligation to do better in terms of cleaning that water up so that it's healthy for us, it's healthy for all the millions of creatures that live in and around that water, and so we can also enjoy it for things like fishing and swimming and all the rest.
And do you think that because of all the work we have done, we have cleaned up certain kinds of chemicals and mud
right
already,
right,
but there's always something new that comes along, and
science changes, so we learn more about what's really going on out there. We get better at measuring runoff and understanding how it works and where, so for instance, the thing we hear about all the time around this side of the mountains is phosphorus. So we have algae blooms appearing in different lakes. I mean, it happens in the small lakes. It also happens in Lake Champlain. And there is a type of algae, blue-green algae, that can produce, doesn't always produce, but can produce toxic substances. Toxic enough that animals that have swum in them, dogs, in blue-green algae polluted waters, have died from those toxins. So it's a serious risk. And then it also tends to have a really unpleasant smell, and it's unpleasant to see. So it really makes going to the lake, instead of a wonderful day at the lake, kind of an awful day at the lake. And it's something we have to figure out how to stop having those happen. One of the things that helps create those algae blooms is sending excess phosphorus into the lake, because it can feed on that phosphorus, the algae, and then you get a burst of growth, and then you get these blooms that are so problematic. So a lot of our work is oriented to figuring out how to manage phosphorus and keep it in place. And a lot of that work, if that falls to all the landscape, it's a naturally occurring substance. But one of the places where it's been particularly challenging is we apply phosphorus in addition, beyond natural levels, to farms to help grow crops.
Uh-huh.
So we want the crops, but we don't want the runoff.
Yeah, and animals, don't they create some phosphorus?
Sure. Well, in the manure, so cow manure, or horse, all manure includes phosphorus, and that's happens for two reasons. One, they're consuming plants with phosphorus in it, and they're also often consuming feed or grain that contains phosphorus. So that too ends up, some of it passes through the animal, then it's in the manure, then the manure gets applied to the field, which has a lot of benefits. There's good nutrients there, and the idea, what we're working out is how to keep those good nutrients on the farm, in the soil, rather than having them get swept off by something like heavy rain events, things like that, and erosion.
Not an easy job.
Not an easy job, no. But it's interesting to see how fast practices are changing. In the last, it's probably 3, 4, 5 years, we've started to see more and more cover cropping. So rather than, they have it in Addison County, I think for a few decades, but not always, has been to leave the soil plowed and open in the fall, after harvesting corn, for instance. And then the freeze-thaw cycles, some people say you need those freeze-thaw cycles all winter long to help break down that heavy clay soil, soften it up, get it ready for spring planting. But the problem with leaving all that, that soil open all winter is that when we have the inevitable thaws that we do off and on through the winter, and we get heavy rain events, that soil is very vulnerable to runoff. There's no plants holding it in place. So we get runoff, as you see pathways sort of cut through a field and lots of water sluicing off. So if you can plant with a cover crop, you help stabilize the soil and keep it in place when those heavy rain events come along in the winter.
And farmers are doing that now?
They're increasingly doing that. And we have, I think, over 30,000 acres of Vermont is being cover cropped now. As I understand it, we have one of the highest cover cropping rates in the United States. So, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% as well. 30,000 acres, 30%. So, it's good progress. It means something like 70% not cover cropped, and it's not the answer to all our problems. It's just one more practice that we can put in place that's helpful to farmers and to the community at large. And the reason I say helpful to farmers is because they don't want to lose soil either. I mean, they're growing their crops in it. And those cover crops too are, some people call them green manure. You can till them in the spring or plant right through them. I
was going to ask that question.
Yeah, plant right through them, and the nutrient value of those plants is incorporated into the soil. So that's so you started talking about planting through a cover crop, and so some people call that no-till planting, and rather than tilling and turning over the soil, you plant right through this sort of green grassy layer, although it can be quite tall. Like ryegrass can be 30 inches tall. So you want to, we're figuring out ways to do things like roll and crimp that cover crop down and then plant seeds right through it and then have the new crop come right up through it.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, so it went fast.
It always goes fast.
So is there something in particular you'd like to tell the people?
Sure, so there's a lot of work to do on our, probably the most important thing we're working on this year is trying to get long-term funding in place for our clean water work. We have right now we're building the fiscal year 19 budget. That's the budget that will start in July of this year, July of 18. And right now we're on track to have the broadest and best funded program in clean water work in the state's history. But we're also looking ahead 1 year to fiscal year 20, and we can see a large fall off in funding for that, roughly a $17 million dip. And given our water quality challenges, Senate Natural Resources and the Senate as a whole wants to make sure that we don't have any kind of falling back of our effort. And in fact, any kind of falling back of our effort would be in violation of our agreement with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. So we need to make sure we can maintain that work, and actually even I hope we find ways to even step up the level of work so we can do even better. So that's our most important area to work in. We're doing lots of other things on efficiency and renewable energy and trying to reduce citizen exposure to toxics. But you and I are both about 65% water. So it is the most vital resource we have around, and we need to do better on clean water work in the state of Vermont.
It's shocking or surprising, whatever word you like to use, that we have so much water in our makeup.
Yes, and quite a bit of phosphorus too. I mean, phosphorus, sometimes I want to make sure people don't think of phosphorus as something toxic. It's actually an essential nutrient, but like anything, you can have too much of a good thing. So we need to manage that, and we also want to have plenty of water around, but we don't want too much at any one place at one time and then end up with problems like runoff. So, but I'm pretty encouraged. A lot of people are working hard on this, and I think people are taking the challenge seriously. So I'm going to stay optimistic and keep working and see what we can wrap up with the governor and with the House by the time we adjourn in May.
And do you find out what the House is thinking about all of this?
Well, so you know how much things can move around, but the House just proposed to raise some of the money to fill that potential $17 million gap through a new hotel tax. And I'll have to be honest, I'm not a fan of just looking to out-of-staters to help fund our water quality work. It's really a homegrown problem, and I think Vermonters understand the mutual obligation we have to one another to do our best. So I'd like to see us step up and do our own best work first before we start asking people from out of state to pay for our clean water work.
Because then someday they may ask us to pay for some of their.
Yeah, I mean, I think we owe it to each other to lead by example, and asking out-of-staters to pay for this work feels like dodging a homegrown responsibility to me.
Yeah. I think we have a few seconds left. Or do you want to say anything about electric vehicles? Sure.
We're working on an electric vehicle bill right now, and I think we will pass something. I'm paired off with the Senate Transportation Committee, so we'll do some work on it. I'm hoping that we can help make the purchase of electric vehicles more affordable. They are good for Vermonters in terms of they're cheaper to operate. Once you own one, buying one is a little pricey still, but once you own one, they are cheaper to operate, they're cleaner, They have a public health benefit to everyone in terms of cleaner air. And the energy for them, since it's electricity, we can produce some of that energy right here in Vermont through wind and solar, hydro, all those things. Whereas if you're buying if you're using fossil fuels, that's fuel that's coming from in the ground out west or down in South America or the Middle East. And all the money to buy that fuel in leaves the state of Vermont. So, or the majority of it leaves. So this is an opportunity to grow our own energy economy, improve the economics for Vermonters, and have a public health and environmental dividend on top. So I hate to sound overly cheerful, but it really is a win-win-win all the way around.
Yeah, good. Well, I guess our time is up.
Okay.
And so you gave a very good talk on energy.
Well,
so
always a pleasure to come in and see you.
Yeah.
And thanks for inviting me back on again.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.